Welcome to another interview episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. Today we have a very special guest. This man has been there since the dawn of the industry, before there was an industry. He was making games back in the days when a computer cost you millions of dollars, and you were lucky if you were one of those privileged people who could get their hands on some computer time. And he has not stopped since. He has been at some of the biggest companies at the biggest times in the industry. He has seen it all. He has seen the crash. He's seen it come back. Welcome to the show, Don Daglow.
And thank you very much for having me.
The pleasure is all ours. So, Don, we normally focus on the business side of things, but obviously your story begins way, way before there is a business side of things. Walk us through how you first come in contact with computers.
Well, to say it was unplanned would be let's put it this way. I was walking down the front hallway of my dormitory in college, and I heard a sound like clackety clack, 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 clack. And I've always tried to imitate the sound better when I tell this story, and I can never quite get the sound of an old teletype machine. But if you Google teletype machine, you can find videos where you can hear the sound of those things. And it's coming from a little storage room, what had been a little storage room off the front hallway of our dorm. And I was at Pomona College in Claremont, California, which is part of the Claremont Colleges Consortium. It's a cluster of colleges. And so I walk in there, and they had two terminals. And a student was at one and looked up, and I said, I think I said something like, "What is this?" I may not have even had a chance to say it out loud. I may just have thought it. And one of the students who was there, who was a guide, looked up and said, "Hi, these are computer terminals. You want to learn how to access the computer?" And this is fall of 1971. And students getting computer access, that was something that was mostly for faculty, grad students, people who were high up in the upper class chain, specifically to do academic projects. And what turned out was that a student and a math professor had gone out and gotten a grant from the Sloan Foundation to bring computing to everyone at a liberal arts college, instead of just those academic and more science and math focused areas. And the best and most democratic way they thought to do it was to put the terminal in the dorm. And they actually ended up with two terminals. And so they got $10,000 from the Sloan Foundation, which is probably $50,000, $60,000 today, I imagine, and put in the two terminals. And members of the group would then rotate being aides, guides, teachers for people who wanted to use the computer. So I said, "Yeah, that sounds interesting." And so he showed me a little horse racing game, which is basically guess the number, and then it would print like six lines of, "At the first pole, 3 is ahead, 2 followed by 2, 5, and 1." And, it was basically a number guessing game. It was completely random, no attributes, no anything. Okay, that's fine. The second game he showed me was a Eliza, which was the kind of the first attempt at a chatbot. Dr. Joseph Weizenbaum had done that. And it was almost a little side project. It wasn't that serious. So here I am typing something to the computer, and it's typing back. For the first 2 or 3 lines, it'll sound like it understands what you're saying, and after that, you realize it doesn't understand what you're saying. But in 1971, this is fascinating, and I was a playwriting major in college. And so if you take somebody who's a playwright and you show them a system that will take text that you write, and then depending on what the audience types, it'll show different text. I immediately looked at it and thought, oh crap, this is interactive. Whoa, this is interactive theater. This is a very, very interesting thing. And then the third thing he showed me was, because I think somebody didn't come in for the next half hour, so I actually had a little extra time, was an early Star Trek text game, which had Kirk and Spock and so on saying different things and getting into a space battle. And I looked at that and I just said, this is just so cool. This is just a new form. This is just so cool. And then he said the magical words, well, would you like to learn how to program? And you're thinking, you know, Pomona doesn't have a computer science major. This is not going to. And he said, no, it's really easy. And I'll show you how. And he taught me the old basic language. He taught me the basics of it. So I just fell in love with it, and I very quickly I'd written an extensive expansion of the Star Trek game that ended up getting picked up and spread to more colleges. I had rewritten completely the concept of what Eliza could be, did an app called Ecala, which was a more ambitious thing. And then I was kind of off to the races on games and got to do games in the next 9 years, first as an undergraduate, then as a graduate student, then as a graduate school instructor. So where most people got to keep their computer access from 2, 3, maybe 4 years, I got to keep mine for 9 years. So
wow. So that basically brought you right through to about 1980. So well into the time period after the Trinity comes out, the Apple II, Trash 80, and the PET. So that actually begs question, two questions really. Number one, once you had the basics of programming down, how much thought was going into it? And I guess there must have been some level of community also around these terminals developing. How much thought was being put into design elements of the games? Once the programming technicalities were out of the way, how much was going into design at that point?
You know, I think, first of all, I would think of it as a hobbyist setting. Most people who were using the terminals were using it for academic purposes. There were a lot of people studying psych and sociology using it for a program called SPSS, which would take data and analyze it and find significant results and so on for you. The people who were studying math or were doing, in our case, since we didn't have a computer science major, we had some people who were math majors but ended up being engineers. So games were not a dominant use. There was kind of a cadre of us around school who worked on games. In our dorm, there was only one other guy who was serious about it. He and I did some collaboration on some things. And on the system, you'd see once in a while, you'd see somebody doing something with a game. A lot of people played the games. Yeah. There weren't a lot of people making them, which surprises me looking back. But you know, part of it is it was a very demanding college, and I did affect my GPA doing this. After my first year, I actually had to have a come to Jesus with myself. A friend of mine took me aside and kind of gave me a butt kicking about, you know, the fact I wasn't taking advantage of the opportunity I've been given. And I was mostly a scholarship student. My parents didn't have a lot of money. And so my last 2 years, I spent less time on the computer, but still a lot of time. But I did raise my GPA back up the last 2 years. Okay.
Now, as somebody who lost basically a semester's worth of GPA to Visual Basic, I totally understand that.
Yeah. And as far as your question about design,
yeah,
the system, you know, all we had was text. It was all capital letters. You could use slashes and periods and colons and vertical lines to try to draw stuff, but, you know, not much. In fact, we had to use the capital letter I to draw vertical lines. And the machines were initially so slow, the terminals were so slow that printing graphics was out of the question because it just took too long. And we had two terminals. One printed 15 characters a second, the other 30 characters a second.
Whoa. Okay.
So that was really slow. And so, you know, whatever you did, I would start writing something in a flowery, embellished way. And very quickly, you got tired of seeing it print out and taking so long, and you got more concise. And in about 75, we got monitors. And that made it somewhat faster. But those were still monochrome and so on. That's the point where I did Dungeon as an RPG. But because that was the first point you could stand to watch the map print. But For me, design was always first because the systems were so primitive. You didn't have to think about the technology that much. You'd think of the design, you'd say, okay, how would I do this? Okay, here's this problem. One of the things that was lovely about it is you could start thinking with design first and then think about the tech because there wasn't a lot of tech to work with.
That's true. So you said in 75 you start getting monitors. At what point did you have your first contact with the microcomputers, the home microcomputer scene?
I had a friend who around 78 got a Trash 80, and that really, and Apples were still very expensive. And as my profession, as a writer, I knew writers starved, and I knew that actors starved. So, and I enjoyed teaching. So I got a teaching credential, and I was teaching actually as a bilingual teacher in Navarro in Southern California. But I didn't have a big salary as a teacher. And so the price of an apple back in those days adds up to thousands of dollars today. And so, but my wife was really supportive of me, and we saved up. And around 78, 79, I got an Apple II. And so at that point, I immediately started taking like my baseball game, which was one of the first original games I did on the PDP-10 mainframe. I started porting that to the Apple immediately. Played with some other things, and then of course, then I came into the industry when the first console wars started.
Okay, and so, and that's actually a fun transition because did you try to release your baseball port to the Apple II in any form or fashion as a commercial product, or was it just a hobby activity for you at that point too?
Game publishing at that point was just starting to emerge, and it was in computer stores, and kind of the back wall behind the cash register. A lot of them had pegboards put up, and they'd have hooks in them, and then software would be Ziploc bags with 5 1/4 inch floppy disks in them, in a sleeve, and then there'd be a cardboard front cover, quote unquote, in front of the disc that was like was the equivalent to the packaging for the product. And then the top of it would have a hole punched through it above the disc, not through the disc. I'm sure somebody made that mistake at some point in their first product. And it would be hanging there. And so you could look and you could see things, and you had this much space. And so, again, not much money. And at that point, with the baby on the way, as a teacher, I had this romantic dream of publishing, and a friend of mine talked about it and started to really think about it and research how we might do it. My baseball game was the first thing I was going to publish. But before I got any real momentum thinking about that, Mattel started building the Intellivision team. And again, pure luck, I heard a radio ad they were doing because they were trying to hire a diverse team. And they were hiring on the equivalent of today would be an R&B or hip hop station, KJLH in Los Angeles. Because I'm from San Francisco, where I now live in the area, but had gone down there to go to school and was working there. And kindness, joy, love, and happiness. And I think it was 102.7 FM. And so I was listening to that station, so I heard this ad aimed at a diverse audience. And I was actually driving along my car. My school district was getting very political. I wasn't very happy. And this voice comes out of the radio and goes, "Would you like to work in the exciting world of video games?" Which at that point is like brand new. And I thought, why, yes, I would. The voice then says, "Would you like to help plan the future of this exciting new form of entertainment?" Yes, I would. And I always tell the story. I had a convertible and I had the top down. I didn't know whether to look down at the radio or look up to God. And then it said, then call 213-978-JOBS. That's 213-978-JOBS. And it was the Mattel Toy Company recruiting number. And they had done a test market for the Intellivision. The Intellivision was starting to sell and doing very well. And so instead of being an experiment they just did with some outside providers, they were now bringing it in-house as a full-scale in-house product. And they started with 5 programmers, a manager and 4 programmers. And, because I heard that ad just at the right time, I was one of the original 5. And I told them, I've been writing games for 9 years. And at first they didn't believe me. And, and then they figured out I was telling the truth. And they were really looking for computer science majors. And they said, do you have an engineering, computer science degree, math? And I said, no, English playwriting is my, but I have a master's in education. And fortunately they interviewed me and they hired me anyway. So
there you go. Now this would have been sometime in 79.
This was actually 80 is when they did the test market.
Really?
And went well and they started hiring people.
Okay. And so when they did the test market and they put together this team of 5 people, 5 programmers. Now, just paint us a picture of what this operation inside of Mattel looks like at this point, because obviously you don't have, you've got the Fairchild on the market, you've got the VCS.
Yeah.
The Odyssey is languishing someplace also on the market.
The Bally Arcade has been out.
Yeah, Bally Arcade has come out. So
which you would code by pressing Shift to pick which letter you wanted to put in, because it had the 9-letter keypad. So it was like typing on a telephone face key set. Yeah, my brother-in-law had one of those, and I actually programmed things for him in BASIC, but boy, it was punishing. It was punishing.
So Mattel, obviously they put a lot of resources into this project. They really thought that this was the market they were going to take this hill. When you get there, what does a development system for this thing look like? What is marketing telling you guys? Who's making the calls on game choices? What does that world look like?
So first thing is, our manager was a guy named Gabriel Baum, who English had lived in Finland and in Spain, spoke fluent Spanish, which was funny because when he and I spoke in English, he has an English accent, having grown up in the UK. He now lives here. And when we spoke Spanish, he had a Castilian, Iberian Spanish accent. So I speak American English with an American accent, and when I speak Spanish, I speak what most people regard as a bizarre form of Mexican Spanish, with all these other things dropped in from the places I've spoken Spanish for the years. But first and foremost, they say that's Mexican Spanish, if they can recognize it at all. And so it was just this funny thing that we would speak English with a European and a New World accent, and then we'd switch to Spanish, mostly just to keep up our Spanish. We didn't use it as a code around people because that would be really rude. But if we were off at lunch together and we were by ourselves or something, we might switch to Spanish to keep it up. And it was just funny. But the first time I ever met my boss, and he's one of the best managers I ever worked with my entire life, absolutely a fabulous guy. He did such a great job for us. We had to take a physical to join the company. This is very old school. Mm-hmm. And let's just say we met at one of the more embarrassing moments of our physicals when I forget who, one of us was carrying a little cup of yellow liquid as we passed each other in the hallway, and realized, that we knew we both were going to be there that day and starting that day because we were going to be in a meeting later, and we both knew we had to take physicals first. And the timing was such, and that's where we met, is in the middle of that fairly embarrassing moment. We didn't immediately shake hands, as I recall. But in any event, but Gabriel really helped us navigate anything. He ended up being vice president of software development for Mattel. later on. And so when I was promoted to be director of Intellivision game design, and then another, the original five, a great, phenomenal engineer, a great guy named Mike Minkoff, was promoted to lead all other development on other systems that Mattel had started to support. So we all kind of kept being promoted together as a team. So long term, that was great. At the very start, the money that originally made the Intellivision project possible, they'd had the idea before. The money that made it possible came from the Intellivision handheld games. And so these were a tremendous success. And their idea had been to take a chip that would go in a calculator. Portable calculators at that point were new. Well, what if we could take that chip and make a game with it instead of making a calculator? And they'd made a football game, a baseball game, and sold millions. One of the biggest successes in the history of Mattel Toy. That money then made the Intellivision experiment feel like it was worth it. And when the test market did well, they said, okay, we're ready to take on Atari, and we're a mature toy company. We've got a lot of advantages over Atari. So we came in and we were placed in with the handheld game development team. So that was a team that had some programmers that were working on the games, and other hardware engineers to do layouts and circuit boards, industrial designers to design the boxes, the actual toy. Some of those guys were really cool guys we became friends with. And it was this wide open space. Just as we were getting there, it was this wide open space in what used to be a warehouse. So Mattel at that time had a 6-story. They now have a campus a few miles away from there, but just off the 405 freeway in Hawthorne, near the Los Angeles area, near Los Angeles International Airport, they had a 6-story office tower, and they had an old warehouse next to it that they largely had converted to offices. And anything that didn't fit well in an office tower got put there. So the toy test lab, where they would take toys and batter them to make sure they wouldn't break and shatter and hurt children, which is a very important function. That was a very appropriate function to have, and move it over into that space, because they still had forklifts running through the hallways, and they just put up 8-foot portable walls, and the ceilings were like, I don't know, 20 feet high, but we had these 8-foot walls. So we walked in, and it was just a bullpen of, I don't know, 24 desks, maybe 20 desks. I don't even remember how many there were. I just can kind of barely picture it. And about the time we got there, I think they did it just like our first week. They actually created cubicles to create cubicles that had kind of the traditional 6-foot height cubicle for us. So we each had our own cube. And all the guys from the D&D Design and Development was the name of that group. For the handhelds, they were all going, oh, wow. No. We were saying, oh, this is pretty cool. And they said, no, this just got here. And I think I'd actually gotten a chance to see it once before they put it in and stuff. But so you go, yeah, that's pretty cool. Cubicles. Wow, we're moving up in the world. And of course, in the toy office tower, if we walked over in there, traditional, very nice offices. And we were always in warehouse type spaces. Because the traditional toy company had already filled that tower. So we always went into overflow spaces they were growing into, which was former warehouse, former factory. So the five of each of us, we had a desk, we had a terminal, and we had we had two, between the five of us, we had two of what were called widgets, and widgets were basically the development platform. So in the terminal, you would work on your game, and on the, but then you had to actually test it. You had to hook up to a widget and operate with the widget to actually see how it would work inside the Intellivision. And so when I first got there, however, I had a different path, because Mattel had both the video game and television. If somebody Googles that, you'll see that. But we also had the Intellivision keyboard. And the idea of this from the very beginning was that you would have your Intellivision, which had a footprint kind of like this. And
like a keyboard.
Like a keyboard. It isn't as long as a little fatter and stuff, but something like that. And then you would have, if you picture a footprint the size of a 28-inch monitor, except taller, and now you make it that thick, and then it has an opening in the middle that the Intellivision itself would fit into and couple to. And the idea was you could buy, for less money, you'd buy the video game. But of course, once you saw the power of Mattel's wonderful computing engine, you would realize that educational purposes should now be added to this machine. And so by upgrading to the keyboard, and we know now that Atari was terrified of this because this unified video game keyboard. And so because I came in kind of as a master of BASIC, and I'd done some Pascal, I'd done some Fortran, I'd done some Snowball, I did some other languages. I had not yet coded in assembly language. And assembly is what, GI 1610 assembly is what we did on the Intellivision. And so they started me out. Initially, they needed more products for the keyboard. And the keyboard had some hardware problems. So the video game master component, which is what the Intellivision was called, was already out selling very well and going great after the test market. The keyboard still was having some changes made after the test market to address these problems. But it ran BASIC, and they said, we need some more BASIC programs. Let's have Don start by writing some BASIC programs. And it was designed to be educational. Heck, he's been a school teacher. He's been an assistant superintendent. He's been a teacher trainer. He's done all these things. Don, what's a good educational thing for us to add that will be educational, will show off the machine? And it's not just words and numbers. We've got stuff for words, flashcards, numbers, flashcards. We got that. What would be different? What would take advantage of the graphics? And I had taught social studies and theater and English as a second language and night school Spanish and so on. And so from that mix, I thought, well, if we're trying to make it visual, one thing people remember having to study in school, because parents make these decisions, people remember having to study learning the states of the United States. And this initial version is only being sold in North America. So I wrote a BASIC program that used the very primitive ASCII characters in these little blocks. We have an ASCII. And if that doesn't sound familiar, somebody can look up ASCII to understand what those characters are and what were the options. And so I took maps of the US and I coded maps of each state, and basically it would put up an outline of the state and then ask you to type in the name of the state. And because the RAM in these machines so long ago was so limited, I couldn't just put up a graphic, because a graphic image would have taken far too much memory. And the BASIC part of the computer was walled off from the video game. It ran only on this computer unit. It took no advantage of the video game whatsoever. So it had almost no RAM. So I actually had to do an offset where I would simply, the data I record was not a graphic image. It was start at this position, put this, now go at this angle, go in one of 8 directions, now draw this. And that was the way in which I had to do the 50 state outlines. So that game became, so marketing approved it, it fit everything they were asking for. It was more visual than a lot of the stuff that was showing off the BASIC cartridge, which they wanted to do. And you bought BASIC as a cartridge. And so, and it would go into the video game and then empower the computer to use it. And so so Geography Challenge, they made a few copies, not very many, sent it to the test market. As I understood it, it did fine. People liked it. but there's not very many copies out there. They may have made 100 or 125. I don't know. I don't actually know what the number is. That's a guess on my part. It is a very expensive collector's item now, and I don't have one, which kind of sucks. But the but that's kind of what started like was sitting in that environment, and that's how that first product happened. And then they said, everything's going so crazy. The keyboard still got hardware problems. We can't have anybody working on anything but the master component. We have to have you cross over. And so I started working on a game. And again, they asked me, what would you want to do? And, which is not the way the world often works these days. And I thought, well, we had a bunch of sports games that had been done as part of the initial test market, so we didn't need sports games. And I was kind of disappointed we didn't need baseball, but we had, for our machine, for that era, we had a very, very good baseball game. And then we were trying, in so much at war with Atari, that we were trying to produce games that looked like coin-op titles. And we had a bunch of those we were working on. And so I was thinking, okay, if I'm trying to do something that's different from everything else that we're working on, what would that be? And I thought, well, Utopia, what became Utopia, the initial name for Utopia was Island. And as a social studies teacher in middle school, where I'd had 6th, 7th, and 8th grade kids, it was a socioeconomically depressed area. My average student on standardized tests was more than 2 years behind in reading. Oh, wow. Now, if you spent time with those kids, you would realize that those kids were actually, a lot of them were very, very bright, but the traditional skills, and a lot of them, English was their second language. There was a lot of stuff going on. There were bullet holes in the front windows of the school. I mean, this was not, this was an inner city type environment. And so you didn't just teach a book in an environment like that. And so I made up a lot of games. We played lots of games. We had one game that ran once a week through the whole year that we did. And so one of the games I had done that was kind of the roots of Utopia was I looked down at the cafeteria floor in our school one day. I was trying to think, how do I teach? I was supposed to teach world geography at this point. How do I teach where things are in the world, where when some of these kids live in an area where they are rarely outside of 16 square blocks, there's personal danger sometimes in going outside the 16 square blocks because of gang issues and stuff like that. And how do I do that? And I looked at the linoleum floor of the cafeteria. It's one of these cafeterias where the tables fold down during the day and then they fold up at night and they wash the floor. Well, when the tables are folded up, you have this big maze of squares. Well, you show any game designer a bunch of tiles on the floor, and you know what to do with that. So I went out that same day. I bought 3 rolls of black electrical tape at the hardware store, came back, gridded off a map of the world so that it would be analogous to, some number of, I don't know, it was 9 squares on the floor or whatever it was. And I did a world map in black electrical tape. And I was lucky because I didn't tell my principal or ask his permission, because this was one of those, it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. So he comes in, we all come in the next day, and all the students are in the whole school are looking at the cafeteria floor and going, there's black tape. Oh, it's a map. Oh, it's a map of the world. Oh, there's the United States. Oh, here's where we are. Here's California. And fortunately, and so then I started designing games for my classes to be able to play there, to give them an idea. Okay, well, yeah, there's an ocean there. How are we going to get across the ocean? Things like that. Before airplanes were invented, how did people have to get across oceans? How far could people go? And, if we're reading in the news, in those days we were reading about things like Vietnam. Well, where is that? How far away is that? Well, you have to walk all the way over here from over here. And so what was cool about that was that, that idea of playing on a map was very comfortable, and that had stuck in my head. On mainframe, there's a terrible old movie called The Killer Shrews, which was set on an island, and basically mild-mannered shrews who've been exposed to radiation somehow grow gigantic, and they develop a taste for human blood. And so this group of weird character actors and ingenues are trapped in this home in the center of the island, and they have to get out. And it's basically pick the moment when the shrews are the most distracted and try and make a run for it. And you won't be surprised to know in the movie, some of them make it and some of them don't. But this is such a bad movie. I'd written a Shrews game that kind of modeled this whole thing. And that was not a very, that's a project I spent a few days fooling around with. So somewhere in the back of my deranged mind, I'm again thinking about educational value, but not direct, but subtle educational value, doing it primarily as a game. Well, if you have very little, these were 4K cartridges, you could not do complex games. And so if you have little, you have blocky graphics, you have a small screen. We all used the idea of the electronic board game, the camera above. We didn't change that till we did World Series baseball 2 years later. But so I thought about, well, bounding the world, islands, the Killer Shrew Islands bounded the world. I was doing a simulation game just on an island. And you could, design a game around and remember what the kids did with the maps. And I thought, okay, Island was the working title of the game, and had the two islands, put them up on the screen. And I'd also seen Santa Paravio, which was a sim game like what we did on mainframes, and had also used some ASCII blocky characters trying to create kind of the beginnings of graphics. So I combined those three ideas, and that produced Utopia, which turned out to be the first mainstream simulation game, and also it's one of the roots of RTS games. But that was how it all started. But they asked me what I wanted to do, and I pitched it, and they said yes. And worked on it through 81. It was first shown at the January CES of 82. And I thought it was going to be a nice line filler. Everybody thought it was going to be a nice line filler. I was at the show. My wife calls me the second morning and says, have you seen the LA Times newspaper? I said, no, we're up here, we're running around, we're at the booth, we're everything. And she said, you're on the front page of the entertainment section with Utopia. And so instead of being a line filler, it turned out to be a legitimate hit. Awesome.
And now, two parts again, the decision to approve a game design that at the time was extremely radical. Because if you look at the competition over on the 2600, I mean, it's a lot of action games. Adventure may have come out by then, but nobody had really tried to do the strategy thing, at least on console. Is that being done by the internal Intellivision team? Is this being done by the marketing people at Mattel in general? Where is that decision power at that moment?
I think that there were tiers of authority. First of all, Gabriel, the boss I told you about, had to approve it. And then the guy who was the head of design and development, basically the handhelds group that we reported through at that time. Later, we became our own separate group, but we reported through him. He had to approve it. He was actually the guy who had hired me, a guy named Richard Chang. And then I don't know who in marketing, but I know marketing had to sign off on it. And I was acutely aware of that because I was trying to think of something. That's one reason I was trying to think of something that wasn't just like everything else. And of course, as a teacher or a former teacher, that kind of came through. But the idea of positioning was part common sense, part wanting marketing to approve it. So I probably would have sought the same positioning if I had nobody approving it, but it was also a good way to get others to approve it because it was good strategy for for the company. And when Intellivision started its own next-gen system, I know this is long ago. One of the things I was actually proudest of in that whole phase of my career, when they started a next-gen system, which of course never shipped, I was given the opportunity to spec what the initial 6 or 8 games should be, and they took my recommendations verbatim on what the initial 6 or 8 games would be for the initial strategic plan. Now, we were going to change that as time went, just based on common sense. So it was a time, if you were making a good argument, you could be listened to. And, that was a very nice thing about time. And, you didn't win them all. But
Of course. And now you said that you were on the front cover. Was it you or just Utopia? Because obviously recognition for game designers at the time wasn't necessarily a priority of a company like Mattel.
For everybody except Activision, it was a secret. And in fact, our names were secret. We were not allowed to tell people what we did or who we were. But yeah, Utopia was all over it, but it was all about Mattel's Utopia. When TV Guide, I think it was 82, did an interview with us, with the development team, one of the conditions Mattel applied to the interview was that they not use our real names. And so this interview comes out, and with a lot of the stuff, you don't know who the hell is talking, because with the names all changed, and you don't know, and not everybody's even named, the English leader of the original team, his name was changed to Hal from Gabriel. That was all pretty obvious that was Gabriel. And some of the other ones, we don't know who we were. So that really pissed everybody off. At that point, we were really getting recruited by other companies. So I was able to leverage that into some wins for the team later, because it was such an idiotic, I believe other words I can't use in public media. It was an idiotic way to go. And I was actually able to turn the outrage over that, teamed up with Gabriel. We turned that into actually getting royalties for developers and getting names on boxes in '83. But of course, by that point, the whole thing was getting ready to crash. So,
gotcha. So before we get to the crash, a couple issues I still wanted to touch on about Intellivision that might also be relevant for later on. Intellivision, just like the Atari 2600, had an issue with third parties making unlicensed. Obviously, licenses didn't exist. Was there any initial consideration given to the possibility of third parties when the Intellivision was getting ready for mass market launch? Or was that still something so far in the distance that nobody was considering it as an option yet?
I think that there was a naive belief, because this was round one of consoles. I think there was a naive belief on the part of the people who were putting this together that, of course, nobody else could ever do it. They don't have the documentation. They don't have this. They don't have that. And so they don't have dev kits. And so I think it probably wasn't even conceived of. And they were copywriting and trademarking and so on and so forth. But the idea of reverse engineering a console had never been done. This is the first time. And of course, people on our side also reversed engineered the Atari. And so the whole process of everybody reverse engineering everybody else's system tended to happen kind of in parallel, because each of these efforts matured at similar times. So suddenly other people are making Intellivision games, and we have the M Network games, which are basically Mattel games converted to the Atari 2600. And the systems were so different that that's a very different conversion, because the Intellivision's hardware was designed a full 2.5 years later than the Atari. And even back then, Moore's Law was in operation. And so the Atari, if you actually go inside the box, what the Atari game designers had to work with was a much more primitive machine. It was written in 6502, very, very primitive 8-bit sorts of hardware. And of course, we at Intellivision, our TV commercials always said, we are clearly superior. But part of it simply, it's like being half a generation ahead in time. Of course we're superior because we had that extra time. And so as it grew, but no, I don't think any consideration was given of it at all because there was no defense planned when Nintendo came back and relaunched the console business. They added defenses, and for that reason, they did better. And there were a bunch of guys whom I had worked with, whom all of us from different companies had worked with, who were at Nintendo, who helped build those defenses, who had been through the crash.
Gotcha. And obviously, we knew we needed to get to the crash, but there was one other aspect about the Intellivision, which was the Play Cable add-on.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did you have any involvement in the conception of that, or in the realization of the hardware, or the way that it was marketed, or what the business plan was on that?
So Play Cable, I now know that inside, especially now that I advise both small and large businesses on games, inside big businesses, you can have all these different little initiatives that get launched out of some executive area and don't necessarily ever hook up with the mainstream of the main flow of the product. And I can't necessarily give examples I'm aware of from other companies because of confidentiality, but it happens different places. So-and-so has a great relationship with this person at another company. Here's a great way to expand what we're doing. It's contained. The attorneys have approved the contract. It's really carefully bounded, etc. And it never comes home. So we had almost everything about Play Cable was a surprise to us. Or was stuff we didn't know much about. It was that independent of us. And so we were aware of it, but there were, God, I don't remember anymore, there were at least 2 reserved memory locations inside the Intellivision. And I haven't thought about this in 30 years plus. I haven't thought about this in 37 years now that I mention it. There were a couple of reserved memory locations which were for Play Cable, and you could never write anything to those memory locations. And originally, our first cartridges are 4K. Those addresses were outside our 4K. Hey, no problem. It's a different part of the computer. So it's kind of like having a phone number that's not in the same area code assigned to somebody else. And all those numbers are for your company, but somebody else has 2 numbers outside your area code. And no big deal. Well, then we went to having 8K cartridges, where they figured out both the technology and how to make it economical. And now suddenly these reserved memory locations are in our cartridge space. So when we're doing this, and we were doing bank switching, which is switching back and forth between areas of RAM, all those things were complicated because in our regular 4K of RAM, we did everything normally. But anything that was banked into the other 4K of RAM for an 8K cartridge, we then had these spots that were blocked out. And they were only a few decals, our version of bytes. But they were just a pain in the butt. So that's the one place where Play Cable actually affected us, other than it was just so odd that it was going on and we weren't involved as the Intellivision game development team.
Wow. Okay, so you guys never actually tried to develop anything specifically for that system?
No, and from what we understood, the amount of money it was bringing in was small enough that it was never anything that made big money. Okay. And so diverting very precious team resources to Play Cable, nobody ever discussed it with it that I remember. Somebody may have suggested it to Gabriel, at which point he might have gone, I believe that probably is an ill-advised idea. But
gotcha. Okay, so let's move on then to the crash. Mm-hmm. As someone who experienced it, what was the first moment where you, as a game developer, realized something was not right?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you what it wasn't to dispel an industry meme.
It wasn't
It wasn't ET. It wasn't Atari Pac-Man. Those were symptoms of the industry, getting big and getting too aggressive. But I think those were the most visible examples. But I think on a smaller scale, we probably had our over manufacturers of games. Some of the aficionados, based on what current prices are for collectors, probably could figure out which games got over manufactured in late '82. I've never done that research to figure it out, but I'm sure that they were. Coleco, I'm sure, did the same thing. So that I don't think that was it. That was a symptom of other things. It contributed in some ways, but it was more of a symptom. I think the first moment I realized it was when we started going into stores and we started to see not only our games for our system and Atari's games for Atari's system, but games like Apollo had a game called Lost Luggage. And you had these fly-by-night, I think I mentioned the Quaker Oats Company opened a video game division. And because everything was selling so great and video games had been so hot at that point for 2-3 years, if you build it for a system, the stores would take it into inventory and try it because it's a consignment business. If it didn't sell, they just send it back. And you give them a credit and, then you give us the new product. And so when we saw this, these games were hurriedly done, the programmers generally had very little experience. The companies were raiding each other, but Atari was the one that took most of the Intellivision people who left. Activision took some. I'm off the top of my head, I don't remember any of our team who we were getting called by recruiters multiple recruiters every day. And I'm married to a games recruiter, and so I have empathy for games recruiters, but we were getting multiple calls every day. But the people who left did not go to these little fly-by-night things. And about once every 3 days, my phone would ring, and my direct line, and I'd pick it up. It'd be a recruiter saying, well, we're starting a new game company in Philadelphia, and we're looking for somebody to be SVP of game development. And we thought you'd be great because you're the head of Intellivision. Okay, no, I'm happy here. Thank you very much. So it was clear that this was going on. Then we saw the games, and they were very hastily built. They were learning projects. Where probably somebody who's a good programmer is learning a very weird new machine because the Intellivision was weird, powerful in many ways, but weird. And so they looked like learning projects. And of course, so that's the first time I realized, okay, this is getting wider, and now the quality control that represented Atari's control and our control, that's bad stuff. And then those games did not sell, and they tended to hit about the same time because once people started breaking into the system, that's when a lot of these new companies started. Add a few months to make a game, a primitive game. Add a few months to manufacture it because it took several months to actually build the ROMs in those days. And those games would come out. And I think, this is off the top of my head, but I think it was around Christmas time of '82 is when they really started to hit. And so, they're learning projects. They did not sell compared to the best of what Atari, Activision, and we were doing. iMagic, by that point, Brian Dougherty, the co-founder of iMagic, had been an engineer on the Intellivision team on the hardware side.
Oh, okay.
So, and we had worked with him at Intellivision, and then he went and co-founded iMagic. I forgave him for this somewhere around 2004, 2005, probably. I forgave him, but no, Brian's a good guy, and the quality that those companies had compared to the fly-by-night guys, it was night and day. So the fly-by-night guys don't sell. The retailers go and say, okay, take this stuff back, give us your new stuff, give us credit, give us our cash back, whatever. But, either give us product, give us a credit, and tell us what product is coming to make sure we want it, or just give our money back. And I can picture the telephone calls where the guys are going. Of course, we had no cell phones then. There's kind of a problem because our new products are like next year. We don't have those yet, and like, well, we could give you that credit, but it's going to be for a while, and we can't give you your cash back. We already spent it. And of course, with powerful people like Toys R Us saying that you can't give them either product or credit is not an acceptable answer. And it's consignment. Consignment was a legally negotiated agreement. So two things happen. Toys R Us and other big chains who couldn't get rid of this stuff put out bargain tables and bargain bins and said, if a typical game is $34.95, mid-30s somewhere, which today is, approaching $100 in today's buying power. Okay, here's games that are $25, and they still didn't sell. Here's games that are $20, no. $15, no. And the bad ones ended up selling after a period of months. They really started to move at 10 and especially at $5. But now what happens is so that's factor number one. Factor number two is that, we've been in a boom fad industry that's got this incredible peaks. Once you start to mature as a business, you hit that peak, you go up, you hit the peak, and then you'll go down some, and then you'll level off in a plateau. And in tech, we're used to thinking if you have a really good product, you'll hit the peak, okay, cools off some, and then you plateau, and then you try and build for the future. In the toy industry, what retailers had learned is if Cabbage Patch Kids or hula hoops or whatever are going like this, once they go like that, they don't plateau. They go way, way down. And so for toy retailers, once something peaks and starts to come down, it's, Jerry, it's time to get rid of that stuff. Take those shelves and give them over to Sesame Street dolls. Yeah, give those shelves to Sesame Street dolls. So as these returns come in, as sales are still very robust, we were making a lot of money, but the rate of sales was not as high as it was before. The market's also getting more divided amongst more players. But retail turns per shelf unit per shelf space, average revenue per unit, all those things were dropping a little. And so the toy retailers say, time out here, this isn't looking good. About that time, it doesn't help that Pac-Man happens and E.T. happens and other stuff like that's happening. Combine all those 20 factors. And first, I surmise, I don't know this, but first I surmise the retailers said, let's reduce our exposure here. And full price games that weren't moving the way they wanted to went into the expensive side of the bargain shelves. And so you started to have the growth of the bargain side growing more and more. And these were in the same stores. This wasn't, bargain games have been sent back to publishers, repackaged in pallets, and then sent off to bargain seller companies for all the history of the toy industry, let alone the games industry. But they go to different channels. They go to bargain stores. They're not competing directly with full price product. So these were right in Toys R Us and all the other toy stores and so on. So what happens, of course, is if you walk in with your kid and you can buy them a game for $35 or for $20, and both come from Activision or Atari or Intellivision. Oh, honey, look at this one here. This looks pretty good. This is a really fun game. And so that started to curtail things. And you can just sense the snowball rolling down the mountain. And finally, the retailers looked at it and said, this thing's over. So don't buy no new product. Just in toys, when you need to get out, you really need to get out, or you can give up all the profits you ever made on the hot toy. So just blow it out. Don't buy anything more. Give that shelf space to Sesame Street dolls and move on. And that's what happened. And so it got to where Toys R Us orders went to virtually zero. All these toy chains, department store chains that we had lived off of, Walmart, all these things went pretty much to zero, and you couldn't sell. And they were selling off inventory, so consumers still perceived that they could buy games. And the channel did have too much product in it. But once they turned off the spigot, if you walked into a store, it didn't look like a disaster yet. But what we started to hear was that our sales were dropping way, way off. So we had somewhere, I think it was spring of '83, we went from hiring people to having our first layoff. So we hired our last employee, Eric Del Sesto, our last Intellivision game developer, who has had a very long and successful career. I'm very happy to say he's a great guy. 2 weeks later, we were told we had to have a layoff. And Eric was such a talented young programmer that we kept him. And you had all these terrible choices about what do you do? And then it was probably 2 months later, we had another layoff. And now we're taking out very solid Intellivision programmers, where before the recruiters were calling the person, once a day. Now we're like, I mean, there's no fat here. These are the best Intellivision game developers in the world. And we're supposed to lay some of them off. And we had those conversations, and we were told, the money's not there. That's what you have to do. And then later in the year, we started hearing, okay, the senior managers were told this doesn't look good. And so but you're not supposed to tell everybody else. So you're trying to find ways to tell everybody else with deniability, so it wouldn't look like you didn't tell everybody else. And we found ways to get the message across. And so I'm sitting in my office one day, and Trip Hawkins calls me, who is the founder of EA. And Trip and I had met at a conference in Seattle, like 9 months before, something like that. And I'd also met Bill Gates there. This is back in days whenever these companies were all small. And so in fact, I met two of my guys who were later my bosses at that conference. And so Trip talked to me, and so I ended up applying to be a producer at Electronic Arts, and ended up going through a series of interviews. They had what I believe is a really good interview process. There's a lot of Silicon Valley traditions. A lot of EA's beginning people came out of Apple and came out of Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox PARC, which is where the mouse was invented. Those were the two biggest companies providing people into the beginnings of EA. And so, great process, incredibly talented people. And so I ended up leaving Mattel. I actually left Mattel. I volunteered to be part of another group departing because my position at EA was not open yet, but it was imminent. And part of what I was trying to do was save another team member whom I didn't bureaucracy being what it is, I didn't succeed in saving them. And of course, it turned out the way the crash went, it turned out not to be cool, because I went to EA and started work at EA in beginning of December or early December of '83. And then the team that was left by that point going into Christmas was told, okay, we're down to bare bones now. Now we're going to march forward and we'll rebuild from here. And of course, the industry's falling apart. You can't sell anything, so you're wondering why. But there's a booth at the Consumer Electronics Show in January 1984. And I had this wild experience. So I go to CES with an Electronic Arts badge, and I see members of my old Intellivision team and go to an Intellivision Mattel Electronics booth and see our products, which is just so weird being on another team. And of course, it wasn't that everything wasn't going. Everything was going across the whole industry. Console games, went down to the point where they, probably less than 100 people working on anywhere and anything related to console games, maybe less than 50 in North America, from thousands and thousands of jobs. We alone went from, I think when electronics was broken off as a division, I think there were 35 jobs with it when it broke off. It grew to 1,200, and when they sold off the inventory to a new company, 5 jobs I heard went with it. So 35, wow. 1,200, 5. And that's what it was like for everybody. So what happened was, after this weird CES, on January 24th or January 26th, I always forget which it is, Intellivision team is called together and told the entire operation is closing, everyone is leaving, pack up your stuff, today's your last day, thank you very much. Ooh. And people were wondering, what were we just told? And then what somebody who really knew the toy business said, here's what happened. In the toy industry, if they think you're going bankrupt, the retail, it's a very bloodthirsty industry, despite, it's fun, it's all about fun and children. And families, did I tell you it's all about families? It's actually very bloodthirsty and ruthless. And so espionage, the whole 9 yards. So what I was told, again, this is a repeated hearsay story, but normal terms of the toy business were net 30. Mattel Toy Company had to make sure that they looked viable and going ahead to make sure that all the Barbie toy dolls and Hot Wheels toys and everything else they sold in for Christmas got paid off. So the last month of the Intellivision team was a complete charade, as I heard this story, which was to keep the toys companies from thinking they were going bankrupt so they'd still get paid. Because otherwise, those companies would just stall and wait for them to go into bankruptcy and then negotiate with a receiver. Well, we might be able to pay you 10 cents on the dollar, or we could send the product back. And so that was the game the retailers would play. So once it was 30 days after Christmas, that money was back. The net 30s were signed, sealed, and delivered, and everyone was shot. And that was the end of those jobs. And so I was able to get, not immediately, but later, I got Eddie Dombrower, who had done World Series baseball with me. Came and we did Earl Weaver baseball together. Rick Koenig, who had done Intellivision motocross at Mattel, did Racing Destruction Set at Electronic
Arts. I love
Arts.
that game. Absolutely love that on the Commodore 64.
Rick is superb programmer, superb human being, just a wonderful guy. One of the most brilliant programmers I've ever met, brilliant engineer, and one of the most humble, not taking himself too seriously, kind, good-hearted people in the world. Just such a true great guy. And deserves way more credit that he's gotten in a PR-focused industry for being such a brilliant guy and executing games so well. The Connie Goldman, who had been such a great artist at Intellivision, had kind of changed what Intellivision games looked like with some of her innovations. And then engineers, figure out, okay, here's how we can leverage that, and 1 + 1 = 3. We had Connie come and work on a number of Intellivision or Electronic Arts games. I did Adventure Construction Set with Stuart Smith. Connie did a lot of work on that. She worked on Racing Destruction Set. I have to go back and think about other ones, but Dave Warhol came across and did some music and audio programming and so on for EA on my projects. And so some of the team I was still able to work with and keep involved, and I'm probably leaving somebody out, and I feel guilty that I'm probably missing somebody. But I was able to bring some folks in at EA, and that was cool. And obviously Eddie Dombrower and I have ended up working together for a number of years, and very good things happened as a result of that. So I'm very glad both times that I reached out and got Eddie involved. I felt very, very lucky I was able to get him. Also, by the way, not only a great engineer, but just a great guy.
Now, talking about your role as a producer at EA, obviously Trip Hawkins legendarily had this very forward-thinking plan and idea of what a software publisher could be, especially in the games business. Now, what did the role of producer in those early days at EA actually entail? Because it's easy to imagine, you're just the guy organizing, the manager of the team. But what did it involve back then?
Well, first of all, I think I agree with you about being there at the time and working with Tripp. I agree with you about his vision. I think some of it was vision he had individually. Another thing about Tripp that I haven't read about or seen in a lot of stories is that Tripp had a lot of all-hands team meetings where we discussed the strategy approaches. We had very open discussions about things. And there were a lot of decisions where Tripp really involved the team. Bing Gordon was director of marketing when I got there. We had some other very, very great people, and a number of really great people. And so, yes, it was that vision, and it was Tripp at the center of it, and then it was the early leaders of the team, some of whom are been more well publicized, others less so, who honed that vision. And then also investors had an effect too, because in a very positive way, one of the first companies or really individuals who backed Tripp when he was raising money for Electronic Arts, Sequoia Capital was the lead venture. This is early days of Silicon Valley venture funding. Sequoia and Don Valentine were the ones who initially backed Tripp and EA. And then he also raised private money. And two of the backers we had were Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss of A&M Records. And obviously now the music business has been disrupted, but if you go back to the early 80s, A&M Records is a very big record label. That is a big, powerful force in the music industry. And Alpert had been a performer himself. And so, they had that money, but they also, one of the things that Tripp and the early team realized was that the idea that all these entertainment media are separate was already an outdated concept, and that games were going to grow to be as big as television, film, music. And that back then that sounded audacious. He and we were called egotistical, pompous, a lot of negative words because of saying that that's what you think it's going to be, and we want to lead it there. And obviously EA's personality did change once it became a big corporation. And this was certainly, this was a room full of type A personalities by any definition. And I mean full, that was what they recruited for. People were expected to speak up, and you could get in ferocious debates, but you were being listened to. You were being given the chance to debate. And so the combination of Tripp's vision, the Eternal team, and the ideas of Moss and Alpert was a couple of influences. And I don't know the exact order of this. Tripp could tell you the exact order in which this came and whether they envisioned our games were shipped in what looked like smaller versions of vinyl record albums. I don't know if Tripp had that idea already before Moss and Alpert got involved, or if that was part of that. So that's a Tripp question. But that became our packaging. And central to our whole vision was, and I loved this, having fought the wars I'd fought in Intellivision, was, oh, by the way, it is not the publisher that is the creative brilliant. Here's a new movie from MGM. Okay, yeah, it's nice it's from MGM. What's it about? Who's in it? Who's the director? Well, in our industry, it was, here's a new game from Mattel. Here's a new game from Activision. Well, for everybody but Activision. Activision was already recognizing names because they broke away from Atari because Atari was paying them less than an engineer might make next door in aerospace, and they're producing these huge hits. Excuse me. So EA said, no, it's the talent who creates the game. That's the talent. and they said it's the model, and this is where we come back to the idea of producers. There were no producers in games before Electronic Arts. And the idea of the producer was to match what a producer does in the record business. And the idea was that that was how we could, first of all, beat everybody else and grow faster, but also lead the way towards a more modern media industry where games were respected. And of course, as a game designer, yes, I love this. And so we were actually trained, I caught the last wave of this, but we were trained by the music producers from A&M Records how to be producers for games. And they openly said, look, you know games, we don't, but we can tell you how we do it for music. So you guys can then adapt it. And they taught us really important things, like, because the producer in records is a semi-independent business manager operating within the sphere of the larger corporation. And so you have a budget, you have money you can spend. For big spends, you have to have management oversight. But smaller deals, smaller signings, stuff like that, you can do just on your own authority. And what you're looking for in the music business is you're not looking for a hit record, you're looking for talent. And they were really clear, they really pounding into our heads. These were very friendly meetings. In that context, they pounded it into our heads. Once you have talent, that's half of the picture, because music is artist and repertoire, A&R. Artist is the talent, the person who creates it and does it. Maybe a separate musician or group and songwriter, but you have that talent. And repertoire is their work. It's the songs, it's the albums, it's the material. And the producer's job is to find great talent and then manage and develop artist and repertoire. So they, not only do you get hit records, but the artist grows. If you do it wrong, you say, chase the market. Hey, songs about kids with flowers. They're hot now. Do some songs about kids with flowers. Okay, that's the crass way to do it. The other way to look at it is to say, we've been doing shorter songs to get more airplay on radio, but on FM, this is when FM radio was really starting to blossom. On FM, we don't need to do shorter material. You can do longer. So how about if we do one extended track on your next album and we let you guys do longer tracks? And maybe we have a couple of made-for-radio songs. They're 2 minutes and 41 seconds. That's the kind of a thing a producer would do in music. So we get all this, and so we're going back and say, how do we apply that to games? And the first thing that's done, and this started even before I got there, was, okay, go find people who've written great games and say, come work under the EA label. Come work under a producer system instead of working either completely independent and risking everything and manufacturing discs that go on pegboards in computer stores, which is how indie games and most computer games, even non-indie games, mainstream computer games were sold that way. And so Bill Budge, Tripp approached Bill Budge. I think all the senior leaders talked to him. Steve Wozniak was on our board of directors, and Woz pushed Bill, hey, get yourself out of stuffing bags in your kitchen, because Bill was, the most successful kind of self-made individual. And Bill Budge, again, another very modest guy, another incredibly good guy, humble guy, brilliant engineer. I had the honor of giving him the Pioneer Award at the DICE Awards a few years ago, and told the story of why he is so important. And a lot of people didn't know that story. They came up to me afterwards and they said they had no idea. Oh, so one reason the industry came back so quickly after the crash in the ways it did, Bill Budge was part of that? I never knew, and he was. So Bill became our anchor artist because he was so well known. They signed people like John Freeman and Ann Westfall, who became Freefall, working as a team. He had worked on a bunch of games at Epix, which was a successful small, back then big, and for our day, tiny publisher. And so these talents were signed for different games, and some were just kids they took a chance on. And so that was the vision. So our job to get directly to the core producing was big picture, artisan repertoire, find talent, sign it, get great games, grow great games. Underneath that, we did the scouting for the talent. We argued for talent and products. We presented our artists and products to do. Each producer had a chance to do one game. If nobody else believed in it, you could do it on your own. You could sign it. If it had a normal budget, the company would do it. But that was your silver bullet. Once you used it, that was it.
Just out of curiosity, when you say the budget, the normal budget, what is the normal budget approximately at that time?
It was different for different companies and games, but for top talent, somewhere from the high teens to the high $20,000s of dollars. So in terms of what the talent would get, maybe 18 to 28, depending on how many people, how long, or whatever. And of course, some projects became the long march, and it became a lot more money over time because companies would keep investing to get to the point where the product could ship. Some companies spent a lot more because they had big inside teams. Sierra built up a fairly big organization fairly early. Broderbund, where I later worked, built up a good organization. And so teams like that were larger operated on a different basis. But in those early days, one rule was nobody inside EA no producer can design a game. Only the artists, the talent, who we called artists, again from the music business. Game developers were artists. Game designers were artists. And so producers could not design. We could only guide. We could find, guide, teach, and develop, mentor, but we couldn't create. And that was to keep the focus on the artists. And what was bad for me was I had always been a game designer, and now I was moving to be a producer. The good part for me was I did enjoy working with people and working to develop them. And the idea of finally giving the designers respect was so important to me. But I missed design, and I kept saying, could I just maybe do this one? Nope, artists only. All the stuff that was in EA's kind of famous PR, Goodby Berlin and Silverstein, which now I guess it's Goodby Berlin, which was a very famous ad agency. We were their first big client, and we kind of launched their business. They also successfully launched EA with this really aggressive marketing campaign. And so as a result, everybody in the other companies really resented the ambition of the campaign. But what's funny is all the things that were said in the press, if you went inside the meeting rooms inside the company at the early days of Electronic Arts, it was absolutely consistent. There wasn't this, oh, that's what we say out there, but in here, yeah. No, it was, and Trip would look any of us straight in the eye and go, no, that's not our values. That's not the way we do this. And again, that was very powerful. So we were actually business managers, teachers, mentors, and talent scouts. And some of the things that game producers are now of helping to influence the growth of the game. But we were supposed to not design. There were some cases where on an emergency basis you could do something. An artist, we'd gotten to help do some extra stuff for Adventure Construction Set for the Commodore 64 version, didn't understand how the aliasing with the colors worked, and turned in a bunch of work at the last minute that would look weird on the Commodore screen and that wasn't the right colors. I spent a weekend fixing it using the art tools, and I'm no artist, but I went and fixed it over a weekend. Those kinds of emergency things we could do, but other than that, we were not supposed to create.
Gotcha. And normally when in the music industry, the contracts between a label and the artist, as far as I understand them, are like a 3-album deal or an advance for the album, and then we'll see what happens with the next album and royalties and so forth. Did the analogy to the music industry also extend to that kind of contract structure with the artist, or was there a completely different arrangement?
And I'm going to give you generalizations because obviously there's lots of exceptions. But the Multi-game deals came later, mostly from other companies, and most of those deals turned out to be disastrous because very few people could maintain the quality level to do it. So, but there was a phase where people were getting multi-game deals. The typical deal was advance against royalties, and the advance was called what's called recoupable, in that if you shipped the game, and let's just say you had all in all $30,000 in advances to recoup, and let's say that you were making a 10% royalty, some were higher, to make the math easy. Well, if a game was producing, if a game was being sold for, and now I have to do all this math in my head, if a game was being sold for $24, or now actually if it was being sold, say, for $16, and I have to remember because different games were at different price points. Keep it easy. You were getting $1.60. If that was wholesale, you'd get $1.60 a unit. So once you'd gone past 18,000 units, something like that, roughly. Once you'd gone past about 18,000 units, you'd start getting royalty checks for $1.66 a unit.
Gotcha. Okay.
And if you never got past those units, obviously, then, and a game that sold 50,000 copies got a silver disc. This is probably by about 85, not in 83, 84, everything was, not there yet, but by 85, 86, 50,000 copies would get you a silver disc, and 100,000 copies would get you a gold disc.
Nice. What was the main source of retail for EA around this time? Obviously, I can imagine the toy stores were reluctant at best to carry. I know Toys R Us was still carrying some computer software, but that was, I guess, around 86, 87. So what was the retail landscape in 83, 84 post-crash for computer games?
So there were game distributors, because this market had existed in parallel to console for Apple II especially, and then Commodore 64 growing exponentially, that brilliant marketing. Mm-hmm. That's another thing behind the crash, is the Commodore 64 was taking would-be video game sales away to home computers, and it was a cheap home computer. Mm-hmm. And so there were distributors in the industry, because the publishers tended to be pretty small, and those distributors then served some of the big chain stores like a Walmart. They would serve, there were a few toy stores that would take product. There were electronics chains that were starting to take some product, not a lot of games. They didn't have a broad selection, but prominent games they would take. But of course, they took a cut. And especially with the crash happening right around the founding of EA. EA was founded just as the crash was starting to take hold. And so another one of the original visions Tripp had that the founders and the board developed with him was we would cut out those distributors. We would not use those distributors. We would go to all of these accounts, because enough of these companies were chains where you had the moms and pops and one store, two stores. We'd get to them eventually, but enough of the revenue was in these chains that if you had regional sales executives across the U.S., that they could each call in enough accounts that they could represent, you could build your own sales team instead of being trapped and dependent upon a distributor who was selling everybody's products. So everybody else was with distributors, and we went direct. And a lot of people said, EA is going to go bankrupt because they're going direct, but it worked. Thank you, Lord.
And you say thank you, Lord, but how dicey or how difficult or how slow was that buildup?
It was dicey for a while, because as the crash took hold, it was only 3 months after I started at EA, we had a company meeting one day. We had a company meeting every Friday where we would go in to our main conference room. And when I joined EA, I was person number 42. And a few people worked at a warehouse where we had our inventory and stuff. So there are probably 35, 37 people maybe who worked out of the actual office. And sometimes the guys from the warehouse would come over for the Friday meetings, and sometimes they wouldn't. And there'd be beer and soft drinks and cookies and chips and stuff. And Trip would give an update. Okay, here's what's going on. We got to see the sales figures every month. We got to see the balance sheet every month. We were shown all of the numbers for the company every month. Complete transparency, so we knew exactly what was going on. And we know what was going right. We knew what was going wrong. The guys in finance who worked on making sure we got paid for our major invoices, for our major clients, would give us reports on, okay, we got the check we've been looking for from so-and-so, and that would be part of a report. Bing would get up and talk about some marketing plans that they were working on that week, and different people would report. Producers would report on something that was going on one of our products. And any team member in the whole company could ask a question of anybody. That was considered okay. I mean, you would ask, you wouldn't say, what the hell were you thinking? You would ask it in a respectful and professional way, but anybody could ask anything. And so it was a really informative meeting, and the beer was nice too. And so, but we had a meeting, as I remember, that was not part of the regular Friday meeting. It was a special meeting. We all got called in. And Trip, other people spoke, but Trip started it off. And Trip said, look, we're running through cash. We're eating up our cash. We've cut back on a lot of things, but we are running through our cash faster than we had planned. And we're not, the crash is happening. We didn't call it that necessarily yet. I actually ended up coining that term a little later in terms of the public industry of the crash. But but he was saying, the numbers aren't working. And now in Silicon Valley, of course, for a startup to say that is not unusual. But so he said, what we're basically going to do is, this is a storm. We're a ship at sea. We're going to batten down all the hatches. We're going to watch every penny we spend. We're not hiring anybody more. We're not going to buy anything more. Whatever it is, we're not doing anything. We're going to save this cash we've got. If we have to go back to the market and look for more cash, we're not going to like the terms in which we'd have to do that. It's not going to be pretty at this point. So we're going to preserve this cash, and we're going to make it with the cash we've got. We raised, they raised $5 million at the start, and we're going to make it off of that $5 million. And so we all looked at each other, and there were more discussions about, some of you who aren't in sales may end up going out on sales calls for sales to extend the reach of our sales team or to support sales. We're all going to do whatever it takes to make this work, because we're going to make it work based on what we've got. And of course we did, but it was scary because, of course, I have visions of similar meetings, a year before, 9 months before at Mattel, and I'm going, oh God, this feels familiar. But of course, it's the same economic factors.
Yeah.
But a big part of my initial charter was to build Commodore 64 product. The company was initially aimed at Atari 800. We had thought that was going to be the computer that would be the breakout computer. In part because Commodore was marketed so effectively, and in part because Atari had its other problems. Commodore crushed the Atari 800. The Commodore 64 crushed the Atari 800. And so here we were with initial product on Apple II and Atari, with Atari as our lead format. And those were both systems that had driven by 6502. It was also good. The 64 was as well. And so we had to pivot very quickly and really go crazy after Commodore 64. So one of the things I was told when I came in is build C64 product. We need it. So that's the lead SKU we want for everything from you, which made a world of sense. And if you looked at the numbers, it really made a world of sense. And so, because by that time, Apple II was actually an older platform and starting to fade. And so we had that focus, and we did, all of us as a group. There were three frontline producers, then one manager for the producers, and we all focused I didn't have legacy products to work with. They did for the two guys who had worked on the first pass, and so I did nothing but Commodore 64 lead titles, and they continued to focus on moving everything to Commodore 64 and doing new 64. And as the 64 continued to do well, that lifted the ship.
Gotcha. Okay. And my last few questions about EA, when that shift happens inside of EA, if you were still there, move a little bit away from the artists.
Some of it was a common sense, pragmatic, let's not be too religious about this, but let's stick to our values, but we don't have to be absolutely religious about it. And then once the company went public, then a lot of things changed.
Gotcha.
So I worked there 83 to 87 when I went to Broderbund, or Broderbund as it's said for the world at large. And inside we said Broderbund. And then I founded Stormfront in 88, came back as a developer in 91 as an outside artist.
Yeah.
And by then it had already changed a lot. So a lot of it happened during the 4 years when I was away is when a lot of that happened. But the first parts of it, I saw some very early parts of it I was part of, in the sense that Earl Weaver baseball that Eddie and I did together. It was never acknowledged to the outside world. My only credit on the package is special thanks.
Oh, really?
But Eddie and I co-designed the game. I designed the baseball simulation, the math, which is the same thing I've done on my other baseball games. Eddie designed the look, the design of how to make the look work and be unique was based on something I had visualized, and then Eddie improved it and made it real, and so and continued to do that. As I said, he is a brilliant guy, but that was a team design.
Yeah.
And as an in-house design product, we broke the rules. We just never told anybody. Okay. And of course, over history now, it's everywhere. People would be surprised to look back and see the product and not see me as special thanks. But in fact, it shipped after I had gone to Broderbund. Is when it shipped. But the reason I was not even, that's why I wasn't credited as producer. But the reason I was never credited as game designer, and never would have been in any case, was to not do that.
Okay. Cool. I wasn't sure if it was issue of Madden, because Trip Hawkins takes some credit for the design on that one. Also, you get Skate or Die, which is the first internally developed game, as far as I understand that. And I don't know where they drew the line between internal and non-internal. And then finally, what do you do once the team is more than 3 or 4 people?
Yeah.
How many people can you put in the photo on the package? So, okay. But yeah, no, we'll leave it right there. I don't want to take up any more of your time. Thank you very much, Don. Thanks very much. Talk to you later. Have a good day.
All righty. Hey, good to talk to you.
Same here. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.